Bonjour tout le monde. Bon matin.
Good morning, everyone. This is the 22nd meeting of the Subcommittee on Human Rights.
By hybrid format pursuant to the order of June 23rd, 2002. Just a few comments for the witnesses and the members who are here in person and participating by Zoom. Please wait until I recognize you to have the floor. When you speak by Zoom and even in person, speak slowly and clearly for the interpreters. They interpret what you're saying and put them into another language, either English or French. For those participating by Zoom, you can choose either the floor, English or French. Today, we're going to be continuing with the study on Haiti. Nous avons deux témoins en person.
We have two witnesses in person and others online.
Le Bureau de suivi de la Cour Montana, Monique Salesa, journaliste, écrivaine et activiste pro-démocrate, and here in person. Also in person, we have Partners in Health Canada, Mark Brendener, the National Director with the organization. En ligne, we have Centre d'analyste et de recherche en droit de l'homme, Gédéon Jean, Director Executive. From the International Crisis Group, we have Renata Segura, Associate Director, Latin America and Caribbean. Diego Darin, Consultant, Latin America and the Caribbean. Et aussi en ligne, par Zoom, Fédération Protestante d'Haïti, Jean Doré Pasteur. Everyone will have 5 minutes for opening remarks, except the International Crisis Group. Given that you have two witnesses with us, you both together will have five minutes. I'll now open up the floor. On va commencer avec...
We will start.
Merci.
Mesdames et Messieurs les députés, au nom de la Commission pour la recherche d'une solution haïtienne à la crise et du Bureau de suivi de la 2021 du Montana,
On behalf of the Commission for the Recherche d'une Solution Haïtienne, today Haiti is a country besieged by heavily armed men and women. Worse, the state, politicians and economic sectors are financing and arming these gangs. We are living in a situation of deep crisis characterized by the denial of justice and of our fundamental rights. The Haitian state is unable and unwilling to fulfill its essential function of meeting the basic needs and rights of its people. The current crisis, created and fueled by men controlling political and economic power, is social, health, judicial, constitutional, economic, and also But the human rights situation in Haiti cannot be seen outside the general and prior context of the political crisis. In the 11 years that the PHTK party has been in power, the state that was meant to protect us has been transformed into a predatory state, a criminal state. It is a failed state with corruption and impunity omnipresent, and also the ineptitude of the police, which have been infiltrated by gangs. The general indifference is driving the population into the streets with their demands for accountability in the face of scandals, respect for the constitutional order and fundamental rights, as well as human dignity. We are living in a situation of insecurity, terror and abuse, which, it must be said, precedes the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse, whose term of office has been marred by 13 massacres, the politicisation of the national police, and the scuttling of institutions including Parliament and the Court of Cassation, leaving no constitutional solution. Ariel Henry, put in power following a tweet from the international community, has no legitimacy. Under his autocratic rule, everything has deteriorated considerably and the gangs have filled the void. And the government has lost its ability to secure even the country's strategic axes and assets, such as national roads and gas. Pas que l'État, say Haitians. The state does not exist. The state does not listen to us. The state does not provide us with services, hence the total erosion of Haitian trust in the state. Yet there are many concrete things the Henry government could have done. But it sat on its hands. Instead of rolling up its sleeves and working, on September 7, the man in holding illegitimate power went abroad. He called on the international community to conduct military intervention on our territory. This is a crime of high treason. And this request attests to the failure of Henry's government and the international community, notably Canada, France, the United States, the OAS and the UN, which installed him and continues to support him despite his illegitimacy and disastrous governance, perhaps because of his complicity in the current catastrophic situation. How can democracy be rebuilt and rule of law restored in this constitutional vacuum? The Montana Accord works for a 2-year breakaway transition to restore the 3 sovereign functions of the state and the confidence in the population, the political system. We must break with this predatory and autocratic political class. We are against military intervention in Haiti. However, we want the national police to be strengthened. We want to establish security on the national axes and connects the country within itself. In this way, the PNH will be able to establish security on the national axes, as I said. Today, the issue goes beyond establishing a semblance of security and is not cleaning things up that will solve the problem of gangs and humanitarian needs. It's not a problem of boots on the ground, it's mostly a socio-economic issue. We want programs to help integrate disadvantaged young men and women into the economy. We want cooperation that respects our dignity and our sovereignty. Urgent humanitarian aid is needed immediately for people displaced by gangs and in occupied territories. Economic recovery is needed for a long-term impact. A sovereign national conference must be held to finally listen to the people. I'm sorry, you have run out of time. Our struggle is part of the search for a Haitian solution, an expression coined by the Commission that wrote the Montana Agreement, which means a consensus between Haitians. Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Brenda.
Thank you, and it's a privilege to share the perspective of Partners in Health amidst the current crisis. And I'd like to thank the committee for the attention you've been giving to Haiti. Partners in Health was founded in Haiti in the mid-1980s, and it's where so much of our organizational expertise and values come from, so we're very appreciative of this opportunity. Haiti, as we know, was the world's first independent Black republic and the first to overthrow colonial rule, setting the path for independence movements worldwide, a legacy that created a better world for all of us, and which we should never forget. We shouldn't forget either that Haiti was made to pay a devastating price for its freedom through reparations to its colonizers and geopolitical sanctions, with impacts continuing to this day. Canada has been part of that history. For far too long, Canada and other countries have taken it on themselves to decide what happens in Haiti, when it is Haitians, of course, who should decide and whose voices we should be listening to. And it is crucial that we are discerning about which Haitian voices we seek out, the voices of the powerful minority or of the vulnerable majority. I say this to be clear that while I'm speaking in my capacity with Partners in Health Canada, a global health and social justice NGO, I do so only with the approval and support of our Haitian colleagues with Zami La Santé, as Partners in Health is known in Haiti. Zami La Santé is today the largest healthcare provider in the country after the Ministry of Health, supporting 17 health facilities across 2 of Haiti's most vulnerable districts, serving a tertiary catchment area of 3.9 million people. Zami La Santé's 6,500-person Haitian staff is of and from the communities they serve, working to support the realization of social and economic rights for their communities and their country. The central crisis that our Haitian colleagues are dealing with today, amidst an unprecedented fuel crisis, gang violence, kidnappings, individual and societal trauma, widespread hunger, and now the reemergence of cholera, is the prospect of not being able to keep health facilities and hospitals we support open. Our colleagues are rightfully proud that all 17 facilities have stayed open to serve patients, when up to 75% of facilities in the country are not able to offer even the most basic care. One of those facilities still open is University Hospital of Mirebalais, a 300-bed teaching hospital built by Partners in Health after the 2010 earthquake. Hospital generators need 23,000 gallons of fuel a month to keep functioning. When the main fuel terminal in Port-au-Prince was blocked by gangs, Zami La Santé staff walked with mules through the mountains to the Dominican Republic, 6 hours each way to get fuel. They did some 10 to 15 trips this way. At other times, they risked their lives to find fuel elsewhere. 2 Canada-funded projects of note, one that has treated more than 4,300 children for severe and moderate acute malnutrition, and another that has provided support for more than 1,600 survivors of gender-based violence, while building links between the health, police, justice sectors, and community and women's groups, adapted their programming but never stopped operating in spite of today's challenges. Cholera is now at the forefront of everyone's mind, with more than 13,000 suspected and confirmed cases to date and 280 deaths, severe undercounts, we're sure. Children under 5 are most at risk because malnutrition weakens their young immune systems, making them more vulnerable to contaminated water and poor sanitation, and therefore more vulnerable to disease and death. There is a global shortage of cholera vaccine because there is limited funding for a disease that overwhelmingly affects poor countries. But Zami La Santé staff know how to respond even in a crisis. They are preparing to lead a vaccination campaign for 105,000 people in Mirebalais, with initial doses expected to arrive next week. Haitians are doing their best in an impossible situation. Our ask is that during this crisis and after it, we find, listen to, and support deep-rooted Haitian organizations working for the betterment of their country, and we do so with what our late co-founder, Dr. Paul Farmer, called pragmatic solidarity. In other words, material support that addresses material needs. We have urgent need for fuel and storage capacity. We need a new warehouse so suppliers are closer to patients and less vulnerable to road blockages. We urgently need medical supplies and additional staff for cholera, and we need to invest further in solar capacity across our facilities to reduce our dependence on fuel long term. Canada can help in all these areas right now. Just as critically, pragmatic solidarity means progressive development and international assistance policies that will allow Haiti to build stronger health systems and allow Haitians and the global community to respond better during times of crisis. I'd be pleased to provide some examples in the question period. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Brender, for that. And on va continuer avec Gendo Jean for 5 minutes, please. Next witness, due to connection issues, from the International Crisis Group, please for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. For clarification, I'll be doing the 5-minute intervention, and my colleague can join us during the question period. Thank you for having us, invited us this morning to join you in the proceedings, and all protocols are observed. The International Crisis Group has been working on Haiti for many years as a conflict prevention organization that bases its analysis in field work and extensive interviews with Haitian actors. We hope to reflect the multitude of opinions we have encountered in our work there. I would like to focus my remarks today both on the merits and the obstacles of the request that foreign armed troops are sent to Haiti. Interim Prime Minister Ariel Henry has said he needs help combating the violent gangs that are terrorizing civilian populations in Port-au-Prince and beyond. The UN Secretary General, after sending a needs assessment mission, agrees that this kind of intervention is necessary. His proposal to the Security Council includes 2 stages. First, a rapid action task force would arrive to Haiti to help create humanitarian corridors to guarantee there is safe passage of basic goods to the communities that need them. He then outlines some options for the medium term following withdrawal of the rapid intervention force. The first reaction of many Haitians to this proposal was overwhelmingly negative, and with good reasons. Haiti has suffered the consequences of detrimental colonial interventions throughout its entire history. We understand and share the demands and concerns that are behind the call for a Haitian-led solution. But as our recent visit to Haiti and many conversations in the previous months have shown, the situation there is increasingly dramatic, and inaction might be not necessarily the best course of action. The war led by gangs has not only resulted in murder, kidnappings, and the strategic use of sexual violence to control the population. The gangs' control of ports, markets, and roads has also limited access to fuel, food, water, and medical services. And now the fast spread of cholera threatens to kill many more. Our trip to Haiti, however, showed us something else. Many of the people we spoke to, particularly those who live in areas under gang control, called for international help. Many of these people spoke reluctantly. They did not want us to think they support the government or they are not patriots. They are also not blind to the difficulties a mission will face, but they see no other option. In the words of a man we spoke to in Port-au-Prince, we are no fools. An armed intervention will not solve the situation, but to stop the spiral of violence, a multinational force is needed. These voices are not heard as frequently or loudly, but they are certainly very much part of the conversation taking place in Haiti today. The merits of sending troops, however, cannot be the only consideration to move forward. It is important to understand that the political context will determine the chances for this force to succeed. Without a broad agreement among political and social forces in Haiti, these foreign troops could end up working to strengthen the mandate of Prime Minister Henry, which is widely disliked among the population, and it could end up making the political crisis even worse. Another danger is that without such an agreement, if Prime Minister Henry ends up leaving power, the troops could find themselves working for a new government that does not welcome them. So this is why it is crucial that Haitians come together in a national dialogue of sorts to determine if they want the arrival of these troops, and if so, what exactly their mandate would be. Ideally, that agreement would also design a transitional government that is seen by all Haitians as legitimate and which can start the process of reconstructing the state, providing its citizens with much needed access to services and rebuilding the electoral system so a free and fair vote can take place in the future. The content of that agreement is for Haitians to decide, although the international community must stand ready to serve as facilitator or mediator if that will be helpful to the process. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Sequeira. Thank you for that testimony. We'll now continue with our next witness from du Fédération Protestante d'Haïti, Jean Deray. For 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour.
Yes, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the House Committee, the Fédération Protestante de Haïti and the Haitian people would like to thank you for this opportunity to review the distressing situation that is imperiling the lives of thousands of Haitians. For a number of years, Haiti has been at the heart of a labyrinth of efforts to preserve human dignity and to help the Haitian people meet their objectives. There are 12 million Haitians who live in extreme poverty, which are already not favourable for human rights and the respect thereof. Haiti is about 70th in the Human Development Index of the United Nations out of a couple of hundred countries. The child mortality rate is 47 out of 1,000. The literacy rate, 62%, according to data produced by the World Bank. It is estimated that there are over 6 million Haitians who live below the poverty rate threshold, and over 2.5 million have fallen under the threshold of extreme poverty. Despite the fact that human development indicators place the country ranked last in the American continent, Haiti is enduring a worsening political crisis that is making its situation even more perilous. For the past 10 years, we've seen a collapse of the judicial system. Most of the courts don't work. The gangs and bandits have taken over the courthouses in Port-au-Prince, saying that they had paid for the liberation of their gang members, but that was not the case. In a document entitled Lac Mourie, We Are Dying, produced by the Human Rights Service of the UN Secretariat for Human Rights, the focus is on the number of people incarcerated before being sent to trial, which is way too high. Over 80% of those deprived of freedom in Haiti still haven't had a trial and been sentenced and are being held behind bars without merit. The government only provides for about 15% of the educational needs of children. There are thousands of children in the streets of Haiti. Some have had to abandon their homes at a very young age. They're deprived of health and education. There are 5.7 doctors or nurses per 10,000 inhabitants. So an insufficient number of hospital beds per inhabitant. Many Haitians live close to the border and call on the Dominican Republic and other neighbouring countries. They are deporting Haitians left, right and centre. Pregnant Haitian women do not get any medical help for their newborns, and there are no social programs available to them. The armed gangs, which are so numerous across Haiti, are taking over some of the strategic areas and isolating the provincial capitals. According to an article published recently, over 500 people were incarcerated without cause recently and held behind bars. All the social layers are being affected. There is famine. Families are being dispossessed of their means and being strewn across the country. Churches are being taken hostage. In Bel Air, for example, 2 custodians for one of the temples were assassinated by the gangs and bandits. The interpreter does apologise, but the quality of the sound makes it difficult to provide a reliable interpretation, but I will continue. The authorities are not making any attempt to prevent this from occurring. The bandits continue to post on social media. There is inflation, extreme inflation, affecting all layers of society. This is an unprecedented crisis. The healthcare system is crumbling, and the population is being oppressed in an inhuman manner. Thank you very much, sir. If you could just wrap things up, we'll have to proceed with the next witness, please. In summary, the fight for the rule of law in Haiti is crucial. Good needs to win over evil. We need to ensure the welfare of the Haitian people. Recently, Canada imposed sanctions. We support that, and we hope that Canada can help our national police and our army and civil society so that we see new leadership emerge.
Maintenant, on va continuer avec...
We'll now proceed with our last witness. There are some technical difficulties, but we will try to hear your testimony, sir. You have 5 minutes. Now, if the internet connection is inadequate, we would ask you...
Camera off. We're going to see how this works. Donc, je dis aux gens...
So 5 minutes, please. Mr. Jean. Mr. Chairperson, members of the Human Rights Committee, Haiti is on the brink. This glaring reality calls on the current government, acting on behalf of the state, to assume its obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. International cooperation to intervene in the name of responsibility to protect. Haitian civil society should play its role. Now, violation of right to life, security, protection of the integrity of the victim. Homicide. From January to November 2022, over 1,192 deaths have occurred due to insecurity. Approximately 70% of these deaths are in the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area. Since November 2018, a series of killings have occurred in areas of deprivation: La Saline, Cité Soleil, Martissan, Bel Air. In terms of kidnappings, the Crime Observation Unit of the Centre for Analysis and Research on Human Rights recorded 755 kidnappings from January to September 2022, including 57 foreigners. Most of the victims are being tortured. Women are subject to gang rape and other inhuman and degrading treatment. Gangs. 60% of the Haitian territory is under the control of gangs, which are officially organised in 2 large federations: G9, Families and Allies, and GPEP. There are approximately 200 armed groups operating in the country, the majority of which are in the metropolitan area. One might wonder if we are not heading towards a proto-state like Daesh or the Islamic State in Syria. The taking of the Varrieux oil terminal hostage by the G9 group for almost 2 months has caused a humanitarian crisis and the almost total dysfunction of the country. Now, social and economic rights violations. In a context where over 60% of the population lives in abject poverty, the price of consumer products has increased by almost 150% in 1 year. The price of the most accessible foodstuffs, such as rice or spaghetti, has tripled in 1 year. Inflation has exploded. It's rising by 8% per month. Concerning education, 47% of schools are still closed despite the unblocking of the distribution of petroleum and oil products. And this situation concerns the vulnerable strata of the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods dominated by gangs, such as Cité Soleil, Martissan, Croix des Bousquets, Centreville, and Bas de Delma. Health. The resurgence of the cholera epidemic further complicates the right to health. As of December 5, 2022, 182 institutional deaths have been recorded and 99 community deaths. 1,177 cases have been confirmed out of 13,454 suspected cases. Governance. Haiti has been stripped of a democratic process. Since the 13th of January 2020, the parliament has been dysfunctional. Following the assassination of the Haitian president on 7th of July, the country has been led by Prime Minister Henry, who's assumed the dual role of executive, president and prime minister, which goes against the constitution. Justice. Since 2018, the Haitian justice system, plagued by corruption and vassalized by the executive authorities, has been dysfunctional. There's been cascading strikes by judges, court clerks and bailiffs, almost widespread insecurity leading to the abandonment of buildings, housing courthouses, the Port-au-Prince courthouse, which has been taken over by gangs. And this is symptomatic of the state of affairs in Haiti. Today, the judiciary is dysfunctional. The highest court in the land is also dysfunctional, and there are only 3 out of 12 judges left. The rate of extended pre-trial detention in Haiti is around 85%. From January 2022 through to today, over 100 people have died in prisons due to the lack of healthcare, food, and other degrading treatment. Most of the prisons, including the National Penitentiary, the Jacmel Prison, the Miragouane Prison, resemble the concentration camps of the Nazis and other similar regimes. Police. Although there are visible and quantifiable efforts being made, the national police are unable to contain the gangs, lack financial resources or training and the capacity to do so. And yet these gangs are being supported by most politicians, private sector figures and others who have sophisticated weapons, plenty of ammunition, plenty of money and intelligence resources. In conclusion, Mr. Chairperson, cooperation with Haiti requires a paradigm shift in order to achieve concrete and sustainable results, in order to respond to the multi-dimensional humanitarian crisis and truly help build democracy and the rule of law in Haiti. I'm sorry to cut you off, sir. Sorry, Mr. Jean. We'll have to proceed now.
Questions and answers, but you'll have the chance to continue your thoughts. For 7 minutes, we're going to be starting with Mr. Aboutayev.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we've heard testimonies that really shed the light on the situation there. And if the outcome of what I heard from Ms. Kryska or for Mr. Brander or from others is that the military intervention is not a favorable solution. On one side, we have the gangs, and actually the last witness also kind of was referring to the gangs' similar situation of what happened in Syria, and we know how that ended up going. The question is, there is the church, and the church seemed to be the only properly functioning entity out there. Do you believe that if you don't support the outside intervention, you don't think the military intervention is a solution? And with such a complicated situation at all levels, do you believe that the church can play a role to really solve the problem in the country?
Thank you very much. We do. As a matter of fact, the Commission et pour la recherche d'une solution haïtienne à la crise that I am honored to be a member of, that is included in the Bureau de suivi de l'accord de Montana, includes the voodoo religion, the Episcopalian Church. The Fédération Protestante Haïtienne was in it for quite a long time, over a year, practically and a half, and then left a few months ago. And we have done consistent, systematic outreach to the Catholic Church. What we have been told by the Catholic Church in different times that we have met with them is that they follow what we're doing, but they did not want to be involved directly in finding a solution because they had been, in a way, burnt already. They had already tried to do that, and the outcome to them was not favorable. We do believe that churches, whether Catholic, Protestant, Episcopalian, and the voodoo religion, are important to have in a solution. Now, because some of them are part of already the Commission and the Montana Accord, the question would be, can the Catholic Church be a broker? Can it come in as a supporter or as a mediator? We do not know, but we do insist that it is extremely important that the different denominations be part of the solution. Some already are part of the greater consensus. What role the Catholic Church will decide to play, because it is the one that is absent, and the Fédération Protestante Haïtienne. So we aim to start re-dialoguing with them, and we believe they are essential.
Do you believe, Pastor Kisomer, do you believe that the international community is convinced that the church can probably play the role of being a broker or of leading the mission to provide a solution for the situation there?
L'Église
The Protestant Church in particular has already made this proposal, that is, to provide the community, political actors, with a commission that could indeed help the situation in the form of a broker in order to reach peaceful political solutions to this crisis. We also believe that not only does there need to be mediation to address this crisis first and foremost, but also one needs to think of what's going to happen after the crisis. There have been transitional periods in the past, there have been elections in the past, but that have achieved nothing. And an international conference in line with the Montana Accord could bring together stakeholders to provide solid and robust solutions to this crisis situation.
The 200 arms and gang groups, similar to what happened in Syria. We know in Syria where those people or these gang groups were supported by the surrounding neighborhood and a lot of intervention from other countries. Who is supporting or who's behind those gang groups in Haiti?
Bon,
il y a plusieurs acteurs.
There are many actors behind this. There are politicians, there are private sector personalities, and also civil society stakeholders that are behind this. It's an extremely complex situation in Haiti, and in order to address the situation properly, we need support for the National Police of Haiti. We need a better equipped police force that can really take on the gangs. This is really worrisome. Women are being raped. There's disproportionate number of kidnappings. There's deaths due to violence that are a real issue. So in that context, beyond even the question of negotiations, we need police forces, armed forces to deal with this. And I think that's the point of view of most of the population that is suffering. We need an external force that will help the Haitian police force to get through and out of this crisis, a question of survival and of human rights.
Thank you. We'll now go to MP de Bourg for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Je voudrais tout d'abord
I'd like to start by thanking all of the witnesses who are here with us today. And I'm delighted to see you all here. We need to hear your input as to how to help Haiti and the Haitian people. So it is through you that we will come to an understanding on potential solutions. Now, I'd like to start by asking you questions in the order of your opening remarks. So, Montana first, Ms. Kleska. First, congratulations on the efforts made by the Haitian people to arrive at a solution. I understand that the situation is extremely complex, extremely difficult. That said, you spoke about meetings with a whole slew of people. But how is it that there was no agreement that came out of these meetings, for example, at the September meetings? Well, in Haiti, what we need is solidarity. We need permanent resistance at an individual and an organizational level. We need to be able to convince ourselves that we will prevail. And by telling ourselves that we will prevail, it's worthwhile trying, isn't it? Now, first, there are a number of issues. We sought a broader consensus in Montana. The first thing that occurred is that we met with the allies of Ariel Henry at the September agreement. And he is with the PHTK party. Now, when Mr. Henry told us that he had neither the authority nor the authorization to negotiate, well, it became quite clear to us that there was an issue. If the Prime Minister, who is illegitimate, but who entered into alliances, says he doesn't have the authority or authorization to negotiate, until such time as he obtains that authority and authorization, any solution is impossible. But let me venture further in my analysis. For the past 15 months, Mr. Henry has been in power. And unlike what Mr. Jean said, Mr. Henry is not the president of Haiti. He is the prime minister, but an illegitimate one at that. He is not the president of Haiti, as Mr. Jean contended. Now, Mr. Henry has a shocking record. Some of the biggest and most shocking massacres that have taken place in Haiti recently are on his watch. We've seen nothing yet. He could have done something, at least. He could have started a dialogue with the Haitian people. He hasn't done that. He could have established security perimeters. He hasn't done that. He has done nothing for us. Mr. Henry is the past. He represents the past. We can negotiate with Mr. Henry his stepping down, but no agreement with him in any other respect. All we want to discuss with him is how he will how he will leave and step down. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we don't have much time. I'm sorry to cut you off. Now, in the little time that's left to me, I'd like to ask you this. Earlier, you spoke about the broad Montana coalition the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, the Voodoo. Now, you know that there is... our committee is primarily studying human rights in Haiti, and yet abortion in Haiti is illegal. In the coalition that you formed, there's the Protestant Church, Voodoo groups, and one section of the Haitian Criminal Code stipulates that women do not have the right to choose. Now, in the Montana group, how are you going to come to grips with that particular state of affairs? Response. We are in favour of human rights. We stand for the autonomy of women and men to take decisions regarding their own bodies. Now, within Montana, and when I say within Montana, even in the commission that has been struck and created the Montana Accord, there is a platform for feminist advocacy organizations that are also strongly in favor of autonomy, that is, the women's right to choose. Now, they have been working and advocating for years to get legislation to permit abortion in some forms. And that is why we're calling on the International Conference and the Sovereign Domestic Conference to stand up. Women's advocacy groups need to stand up, as well as human rights advocacy groups, to bring this question to the fore and determine how to proceed. Thank you very much. A final quick question, if I may. I know I have about 60 seconds left. Ms. Kleska, in the Montana group, we know rather that Canada sanctioned a group of senators that are members of the Montana group. What's your response to that? Well, if I could just correct something here. Those senators were not part of the Montana group. I'm sorry to burst your bubble. In the wake of the Montana Accord, we attempted to broaden the consensus, and we entered into a dialogue with various political groups. And that is how we reached a consensus. And therefore, Le Pen and Gray, the President of the Senate, they were part of this group, Peine Modifiée. And at no point in time were they fully fledged members of the Montana group. It was instead a broad consensus, i.e. the Montana consensus that was reached with the parties who are part of the group Peine Modifiée and Gray. So if you'd like me to talk about sanctions, I can elaborate, but you've told me that you don't have enough time. You're right.
We'll now hear from Monsieur Brunel de Sepp for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, on va profiter.
Thanks. Please proceed and tell us about the sanctions. Well, thank you for that opportunity. We are in favor of sanctions. We've been saying this for over a year, that the various partners to Haiti could enact legislation, put in place policies with respect to arms control and sanctions. But let's tread carefully here. One thing that we have observed is that those sanctions, especially sanctions on the economic sector, the 3 individuals who've been sanctioned to date have control of the banking sector to a large extent. So it's important to note in relation to this that there needs to be financial support to the banking sector, which is already fragile. That needs to be considered, along with other financial support measures for Haiti. So sanctions are all well and good. You're an autonomous state. You've imposed sanctions. We appreciate that. And there are a lot of names that are not still on that list of sanctions, but there needs to be other support measures. And to some extent, the Haitian people should be able to have domestic sanctions put in place. When it comes to our own legislation in Haiti, in terms of what you're going to freeze or seize or confiscate, is the onus on the Canadian government to take action, or is it on the Haitian government when a transition government is put in place? But all of that needs to be discussed as part of a cooperative framework with Canada and other allies and partners, and a transition government. So what you're saying is Mr. Henry would no longer be in power and he'd be ousted. Now, the analysts are drafting the report on our behalf, but there have been a number of witnesses that have appeared before us, and you're not the first to say this. There are other witnesses who have said this. Mr. Henry's government is not legitimate, either in the eyes of Haitians in Haiti or the Haitian diaspora in Quebec, in Canada, in the US and elsewhere. That much is quite clear to us. In your opening remarks, you said that there's a political crisis, but the humanitarian crisis won't be addressed until the political crisis is. Could you elaborate on this? Because I think that's the centerpiece at the end of the day. In our report, in our recommendations, we need to understand why you've come to this conclusion. Understood. Well, listen, I think that virtually everyone has come to the conclusion that these gangs are being financed and armed by a number of sectors. Let me give you an example of the instrumentalization of these gangs. Recently, in the World Cup, the government had the weird idea of giving television sets to people in the community so that they could watch the World Cup. So the Henry government decided to give away TV sets for free to the Haitian population so they could watch the World Cup. He invited community leaders to be part of this process. Among them, there were gang members, and one of them was arrested at the time. Now, that's the first thing. Now, during the COVID crisis, there was a procurement process, and the individual who coordinated the procurement process was Mr. Jerry Bouzou, whose nickname is Barbecue, and he is a gang leader. A number of human rights advocacy organizations have reported on this, and the Harvard Law School has attested to the fact that in the Salim massacre, which was the very first massacre to undermine civil society, it occurred in October or early November 2018. And it clearly demonstrated that, well, there was Mr. Montchéry, who was the Director General of the Interior Department under Moïse. There was Mr. Duplain and Mr. Cherizier as well, who at the time was a police officer. There is complicity, an instrumentalization of the process, and as the Haitian people say, collusion. Collusion, in other words. Yes, you've hit the nail on the head. Well, maybe not in a legal sense, but indeed, collusion, complicity. Now, what we're saying here is that the PHTK that's in power with Mr. Henry and has been for the past 11 years is in bed with the gangs. There are just so many examples of this. So we can't turn around and say now, well, we're going to continue with the status quo and head towards a new Haiti with elections, with them in there. It's impossible. I don't have much time left. It's just so crucial what you're telling us. Our report will help us to make headway. There's a Canadian delegation who is on its way. The government and the House of Commons need to... Do I have any time left, Mr. Chair? 30 seconds. Okay, it's important what you're saying to us here. It's not just about Mr. Henry, it's his entire party. Now, in the 30 seconds remaining, could you tell us why Mr. Henry is not the only issue, and tell us about those others? Now, well, it's the whole PHTK regime that's been in power for the past 11 years. Mr. Martelly, Mr. Jovenel Moïse, and now we have Mr. Henry, who was chosen by Mr. Jovenel Moïse. So they have transformed the state into a predatory and criminal state. There are a number of ministers that have been accused of human rights violations. There have been ministers who've been accused of rape. So, in other words, we have a criminal state in power. It's a predatory state in relation to the Haitian people. Now, we are surprised. We don't understand how it is that Canada can continue to have any relationship with Mr. Ariel Henry. We just don't understand it. Thank you very much. And sorry to the other witnesses. It was just so interesting what you had to say. Thank you.
We'll now have 7 minutes from Ms. McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to all of the witnesses today. This has been very enlightening, very interesting, and I think, as my colleagues have mentioned before, extremely important for us to understand what's happening in Haiti, so that we can provide whatever assistance we can. Very interesting testimony as well, Madame Klaska, that you've just said. And what I was sort of hearing from my colleague from the bloc is that there needs to be that political response first, but we've also heard from Mr. Brender that there is this humanitarian crisis that is so pressing at the moment. I'm struck by the fact that it looks like we will have to do many things at the same time to help Haitians as they deal with the cholera, they deal with security, the failure of their democracy, and all of that colored by the idea that interventions in the past and actions that have been done by the international community in the past have made it less, have tainted what we do going forward. So Madam Klaska, I'd like to start with you. I know you've met with many Haitian Canadians over the last several weeks. I know you've had an opportunity to talk to, I think, over 50 groups of Haitian Canadians. Could you tell us what the Haitian Canadian community is asking for, what they are talking about, please?
We met perhaps with less than 50, and we met with several. There are other groups of that we met with in terms of de Montana, not me personally, but we met also recently with the Coalition des Haïtiens contre la dictature. And what came through very clearly, and we have met with them before, and what came through very clearly is the sentiment that everyone, there is no dispute in terms of the crisis, in terms of the situation, the dire situation. And I think from hearing all the different people, the witnesses, there is no, we are living a dire emergency. We are surviving day by day, barely surviving, if this is what it is called. But the problem is, yes, we do have different emergencies going on. The problem is, how do we resolve them? We can no longer sit in Haiti and say, come and help us resolve it. You do it. You bring the boots on the ground. It can no longer work. It has not worked in the past. So I think this is what I'm hearing from the compatriots in Canada that we have been speaking to. It has not worked in the past. It has brought cholera. It has brought a sexual abuse. It has not reinforced Haitian civil society, Haitian institutions, the Haitian state. We need a different model. And what we are saying is the model must be a transition where then we can ourselves, our sovereign selves, with our dignity, we can talk to Canada as two states talking to each other, and we need cooperation. We know we need the help. We know we need assistance. We have asked for assistance, but we do not want the boots that are coming as a result of Mr. Henry saying, come intervene, because some of what he could have done, he has not done. He has crossed his arms. So this is what we're saying. This is what we are hearing also from Haitian origin Canadians, if I can say it that way. Thank you.
Thank
I
you
hope
very
I have
much.
responded.
And I would, you have, and I would like to also ask my next question of Mr. Brender, if I could. Mr. Brender, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your work and to give my condolences for the loss of Paul Farmer this year. I know he was an incredibly important person in the humanitarian sphere. So my sympathy with you. You spoke a little bit about the cholera pandemic, what's happening on the ground with regards to the cholera pandemic. And what I'm struck with is the idea that we need to have a better way to get the cholera vaccine to communities, that we need to have long-term, strategic, predictable funding for local CSOs. Can you talk about Canada's response, what Canada can do with regards to drug procurement, what Canada can do with regards to humanitarian aid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think, from abroad, one of the challenges in crises has always been that we respond to the immediate crisis, what's just in front of us. And we lose sight of kind of the long-term policy frameworks that have got us to this place. And part of those long-term policy frameworks is that in times when there's not apparent crisis, we allow cholera stockpiles of cholera vaccine to dwindle to nothing. And so Canada can play a leadership role in times of apparent peace. And Paul, had a phrase called acute on chronic. And that's what's happening in Haiti right now. It's very acute. It's more acute than it's ever been. But the chronic situation, certainly for health, for education, also ties into, chronic underfunding of health for diseases that affect poor countries because of all the underlying social and economic conditions. Cholera is there because there's no water and sanitation. And part of the result of the 2010 earthquake was not investments in Haiti's public sector to be able to build long-term WASH standards within the country that would have helped prevent the cholera right now. So I think it's, despite the fact that we're in this crisis, we need to maintain a long-term perspective from a policy. What is Canada doing in the humanitarian and development space that has a long-term vision? And the 2010 earthquake, one of the things that Partners in Health did was build this teaching hospital. And at the time, we were heavily criticized for it because people said, how can this be a priority in a time of crisis? Well, when there was the Haiti earthquake last summer, the people that responded were people that were trained at that hospital through the residency programs. And it was a 100% different response than 2010. It was a response led by Haitians, in part because we made an investment in health infrastructure and training and teaching that allowed there to be some capacity to respond. And I think that's exactly the right question to be asking is how do we, not have blinders? It's incredibly important, everything that we're talking about security and what the international community is going to do to respond to so many crises, but we have to do it with an eye on long-term policy that includes how we approach political leaders, but also to what are we doing to ensure that poor countries have capacity to respond during times of crisis.
Thank you. We now have 5 minutes from Mrs. Vanderbilt.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to just ask Ms. Segarra and pick up on something that you said in terms of the multilateral foreign intervention. And the reason I'm asking that is that most of the witnesses, certainly the civil society witnesses that we've heard, have been quite vociferously opposed to having a foreign military-style intervention. And one of the things that we heard is that a lot of the gangs are actually children who've been forcibly separated from their families and then put in orphanages and then recruited into gangs. And so the specter, particularly if Canada were to send soldiers to this, would be Canadian soldiers face-to-face with armed gangs, potentially in a shooting battle of what are essentially child soldiers. And the other thing, of course, is what you said, is that it's better than the alternative of inaction. I think we've heard a lot of alternatives throughout the course of the study, including the sanctions, including stopping the arms. The oligarchs that are actually supporting these gangs are the ones that we need to be going after, and stopping the arms from getting in through the border, among a number of other things that we've been told would be potentially, also including capacity building for the police, the local police. So I just wonder, what, given all of that, what your reasoning is for wanting to have a multilateral force.
Thank you. We are very aware about all of the difficulties that bringing a mission will bring, particularly those that you have mentioned, the terrain where the confrontations will be. That's all certainly the case. But the truth is that the international community has supported in the past and for many decades processes to strengthen the national police. This is not the first time that we're talking about vetting, about giving them technical expertise, training. Unfortunately, those processes take a lot of time, and as we know, in some cases, they don't produce the results that we need. And so when we think that definitely those other policies that you mentioned are necessary, and it is true that the sanctions has had an incredible impact right away, we do think that a very carefully planned organization of troops that do bring humanitarian corridors that allowed for the provisions to get to the communities and loosen a little bit the grip that the gangs have over the communities would allow for air to come into the country, for political processes to go forward, for a transitional government to be able to work. I think we very much agree with Ms. Kleska's assessment that really the idea of bringing troops needs to be planned in very close coordination with a political agreement. It is very dangerous that the troops will be seen by Haitians as force strengthening Henry's mandate. Okay. And that is in no way what we suggest.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres témoins qui veulent ajouter quelque chose?
Would any other witnesses like to add anything? Well, thank you for that opportunity. I agree entirely with Mr. Brender on the issue of investment and humanitarian investment too, to ensure that our development can be jump-started. And that is, it's also from a security standpoint. As I said, it's not a question of boots on the ground, but mostly a socio-economic problem. And that's how Canada can help. And that's why I said that we need programs that help our youth that have been, in fact, excluded from our economy. Our country is deeply unequal. There is deep-rooted inequality. So that's why we need that kind of program. We don't just need boots on the ground in our neighbourhoods. No, that won't resolve the problem. And I also would go so far as to say that it's dangerous. If we say that that's what we're going to do, Haitians are going to say, well, perhaps Canada's thinking, perhaps they'll send troops, and then we'll just be in a waiting or a holding pattern, just like Mr. Henry has said that he is thinking about things. And I say no to an international foreign military intervention. The Montana Accord group agrees with this. And a final small point, if I may. During the earthquake that Mr. Brender referred to, there was humanitarian assistance from abroad. But in the first especially the first 3 to 5 days in the wake of the earthquake, it was Haitian solidarity that came to the fore. And that is why I say that's what it means to be Haitian. We don't need everything. We don't have everything at our disposal to achieve our goals, but with investment in our development, in our long-term future, and with a state that isn't predatory and stealing our resources, we will be able to succeed and prevail. 57% of Haitians don't have access to any health care. There needs to be investment, and this is a very positive form of investment that's being proposed.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses again. Haiti has 200 years of independence, but situation continue to be crippling, to be deteriorating further. We've heard big no to military intervention. In the meantime, we've heard that from Ms. Segura that a mandate needed for an intervention or for outside military. And she also spoke about detrimental colonialism, which is something that was repeated several times. The question is, it looks like we're in front of a solution that has to be a Haitian solution, has to be from within the country, whether the church, whether the different groups, whether the civil society. So if we're in front of that, how does that solution look like in the eye of the witnesses? And I would ask that question to Ms. Segura, and I would also appreciate Ms. Kleska to have a comment on that too.
Thank you. I mean, in crisis group perspective, what is indispensable is an agreement, a national dialogue around the sort that Ms. Kleska was proposing. We think that if there is a very defined mandate for what the troops should do and what should not do, and the focus is on bringing humanitarian access to the communities, only if there is a political agreement ahead of it, it will be successful.
Do you believe that mandate has been discussed at this point, since Canada has announced that it is willing to intervene?
No, I don't think that the Haitian mandate is there yet. No, and without it, we would not advise for sending troops.
Ms. Kleska, would you like to comment on the question?
We met with the Canadian delegation that is right now in Haiti. We met with them yesterday, and they said essentially what I'm saying. We are against a military intervention in Haiti. However, we know that we need assistance. And right now, with the state of things in Haiti right now, we cannot have any kind of a long-term assistance that is being negotiated. Everything practically is on a standstill. Now, we have been advocating and since the accord of August 30th for a larger consensus. And to us, a larger consensus means, as I mentioned, talking to the different church denominations, the private sector. We've had over 20 meetings with different elements of the private sector, with the different groups, etc. We are also, in terms of the diaspora, Haitian Canadians, Haitian Americans, Haitian French, we have had meetings with them. They are part of the accord, but we are also reaching out so that there can be more who are part of it. What we believe is we need to broaden the consensus. We have also a roadmap. We have kind of gone a little bit more in terms of the roadmap elections, the Conférence Nationale, humanitarian assistance, the security assistance, and redressement économique. We believe these are important things to move forward with immediately. So we are, I believe, very clear that this is what we are looking for. A larger consensus, a transition of 2 years, and we negotiate with Monsieur Henry how and when he will leave, because he is no longer part of the solution. In fact, he is part of the problem with a lot of the things that are going on with the gangs today.
Thank you. That's a great roadmap. So what's left for Canada, for example, in this whole picture to do? Is it a direct financial contribution. What is it? How do you see Canada's role in specific be the best to be most effective?
Yeah, I believe Canada has been an important partner of Haiti, and I think Canada will continue to be an important partner in Haiti. For example, in the area of gender, one of the big issues that is on the table is sexual violence with the gangs and in general in Haiti. And I think Canada has been a leader in that area. And not only recently, but for a long time, Canada has kind of set the model in terms of that. And I think that ought certainly to continue. And linked with that also a lot of early sexual debut that brings about also a lot of one of the violation of human rights, which is a lot of teenage pregnancy, forced. And I think all of that is part of the package. But another area in terms of security...
my apologies. Thank you.
Sorry.
We reached the time limit for this.
I can't finish my phrase.
Your phrase,
Sorry.
yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead, please. Finish.
Okay. What I was going to say in terms of security, Canada, France, and the United States are major donors in terms of security. I believe Canada could play a leadership role in that because each works independently. Why not have a kind of partner in terms of security? And Canada can actually play a leadership role in that, as they did.
We need to continue. There is strict timing.
Okay. Thank you.
We now have, on va avoir Monsieur Brunel Duceppe.
Mr. Bruno Duceppe, 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. This study is just so important for what is to come. Now, Ms. Kleska, you said that Canada, the US, other foreign powers have been intervening for years with the results that we are fully aware of, the pitiful results. And you said that you're completely against military interference, but a lot of witnesses have said the police need help, the security forces need help. So how do you not intervene on a military level and yet help the security forces in Haiti? Well, there's a big difference between Mr. Henry, who's calling on military intervention, where troops arrive in Haiti and intervene, and a proper transitional government where we sit down together and discuss our security needs, what we need from our police, and we have always called for a strengthening of the national police. Technical assistance, financial, technological and logistical assistance. But this must be determined by a legitimate transitional government so that we can move forward together. Mr. Henry lacks legitimacy. His government is in bed with the gangs, colluding with the gangs. So what should we do? That's the problem. There's the rub, and we agree, there is a consensus around the fact that our future is not with Mr. Henry. We want assistance, but we want to be able to define the assistance we need. Well, I understand that we need to have Mr. Henry ousted. That much is very clear to me. You referred earlier to corruption issues. Even within the Haitian police forces, are they innocent? Because perhaps there's a problem that needs to be addressed there first before we strengthen the security forces. We need to clean up the police. Is that the case? Response. Well, yes, there are some police that are highly trained, that have a wealth of experience, and that who would be better able to respond to your question. But from what I've read, and in the discussions that we've held with security experts, there are issues to do with the police. There are also staffing issues. There are a lot of police that were killed or assassinated in recent days and months. So there are staffing issues. Some have left. Many have left. A police officer's wages are just pitiful. and that in and of itself endangers their lives. It's a terrible situation, and as I said in my opening remarks, there are police officers that are implicated with street gangs. Some have been arrested, but some are colluding with the police. There needs to be better vetting. And maybe the uniform itself actually needs to be changed as a symbolic measure. Yes, there are problems. We're fully aware of them, and we do need assistance. But if you swoop in with your troops, no. Well, we understand that. I don't have much time, so I know that our analysts are great folks who are very smart and very pragmatic, and they're going to draft an excellent report. Now, since the very beginning, I think this is quite clear. You don't want to hear about direct military intervention. You need equipment and a bolstering of the security forces. Now, what about the possibility that some of the security elements within the security forces are corrupt? You know, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do we clean up the security forces first, or do we immediately ship in equipment? Which comes first, in your opinion? Because we're going to have to make recommendations, and that's why I'm asking this question, and perhaps other witnesses would like to chime in response. Well, if I may, and I want to give the other witnesses an opportunity to respond too. What we've heard from experts, security experts, and I a moment ago alluded to vetting, which I imagine has already begun, but we also need to depoliticize the police. Mr. Jovenel Moïse had this as a cornerstone of his regime, and now there's a new director, Mr. Elbé. I can't speak to what Mr. Elbé is currently engaging in, but we get the sense that there is a dwindling politicization, and that's a good thing. That's crucial. Now, technical aid. We don't just need equipment. We need women and men who provide training. That also might be helpful. We're open to that. We need to define that, however, as part of a collaborative agreement between legitimate states. Thank you very much.
We'll have Madame McPherson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to take a moment. I noticed that some of the other witnesses were interested in speaking to that last point. Mr. Darin, I believe you had your hand up.
Oui, bonjour, merci.
Yes, thank you very much. As Ms. Kleska said, there are three main issues with the PHTK and the National Police. There is a staffing problem. There are about 13,000 active officers currently. So if you do the math, and the experts have done the math, about half are in bed or colluding with the gangs. There are a number of special units, however, that have been trained and have been vetted, properly vetted, vigorously vetted, and they should be able to carry out an operation with our domestic troops who at some point will be able to intervene. But the crucial point here is at the same time, there needs to be, as I said, special units trained. There needs to be proper vetting across the entire police force. But before any physical intervention, there are prerequisites and other steps that need to be taken. There are folks who work in the areas that are being controlled by gangs and by bandits, and the community leaders are afraid of foreign military intervention. And in the wake of the call on the part of President Henry for military intervention, there has been a noticeable reduction in conflict between the various gangs from one community to another. So we need to provide infrastructure to accommodate all of those thousands of people that flee particular areas. There are thousands of displaced people in the metropolitan area of Port-au-Prince, and the police forces need to engage in further vetting in order to better lead those operations in those particular areas. Now, when support does arrive, I'm hearing that there are images of troops that are being circulated and by way of a threat. And I think that negotiations need to be started with the leaders as well.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to stay with you, if I could, with the International Crisis Group. I'd like to get a better understanding about the gender-based violence and how Canada can help with regards to the gender-based violence we're seeing on the ground. If I could ask either Mr. Darin or Madame Segura.
Merci pour votre question.
Well, thank you for your question. Normally, to get support from the local population, the gangs have protected those people within their area or zone. But in the past year, the civil population hasn't been protected when there is conflict between gangs, unprecedented level of conflict between May and July 2022. The population, particularly women, have been subject to gang rape, filmed, posted on social media. It's happened in the presence of their families, and that's a way of asserting control over the population and demonstrating strength vis-a-vis the other gangs from outside areas. So what has to be done? We need to clamp down on these areas that have been taken over by these gangs. The police need to step up to the plate, step in with a view to at least reducing this level of this extravagant violence against women, children, and boys and girls.
Thank you very much. Is there any other witnesses that would like to speak to the gender-based violence that we're seeing in Haiti? I know I only have a few moments left.
Within 30 seconds.
Ms. Kleska?
Entre 30 secondes.
In 30 seconds, please.
Say that it is also a structural problem. I don't like the term, but gender-based violence is a problem in Haiti, and it is a patriarchal society, and we need much more work in terms of changing social norms to deal with gender-based violence. So it is not a question of control of troops, etc. No. Yes, the gangs have made the bodies of women as a war territory. But we have to be real and say that gender-based violence, I can't say is endemic in Haiti, but it is a huge social problem that needs a lot of work and reformatting the way we actually bring up our children. So this is a long time investment, and Canada has been involved with that, and we need more support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And on that somber note, we're going to conclude our testimony around Haiti. Thank you to all the witnesses. Merci à tous les témoins d'être ici, for being in person, Madame Seska and Mr. Brenner, for being here in person, and for participating by Zoom, Monsieur Jean, Mrs. Segura, Mr. Darin, and Pastor Doré. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde d'être ici.
Thank you to each and every one of you.
Now going to be going into closed session. For those online, we ask you to, as swiftly as possible, change your Zoom links. Again, thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Please do watch the committee and what we will likely be producing with respect to a statement on this issue. We invite you to see if and when we will produce that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.